8 months after Gerald Ainsworth took the house on Edgewater Lane, the half-ton truck she had driven for 9 winters, and the right to put her own children to bed at night, Maureen Doucet spent the last $140 to her name on thread, cotton batting, and a folding table at the Halifax Seaport Market. The following spring she stood under studio lights, with a camera trained on her face and a country watching. Gerald was watching too, from a leather chair in a condo he could no longer afford, and he was not ready for what he saw. He had spent 14 months making sure she would have nothing left to stand on. He had never once thought to ask what she was already standing on. She grew up in Mahone Bay on the south shore of Nova Scotia, in a saltbox house 2 streets back from the water that smelled all year of cedar and coffee, and faintly of the lavender her grandmother kept in a bowl by the door. The house belonged to Iris Doucet, born in 1938, who had lived in it for 51 years, and quilted in the front room every evening of her life that she was well enough to hold a needle. Iris quilted the way other people prayed. She made quilts for new babies and for caskets, and for every couple in the parish who got married, whether she liked them or not. She never charged anyone a cent. When the fog rolled in off the bay and sat over the town for 3 days straight the way it does down there, people said you could find a Doucet quilt on half the beds in Lunenburg County, holding the cold-off children who had no idea whose hands had stitched it. Iris kept her patterns in a book she had bound herself. Brown paper covers gone soft as cloth, every page in pencil because she said ink lied, and pencil told the truth and could be corrected. 200 and some pages. 40-odd years of winters recorded 1 block at a time. In the margins she wrote notes to herself, and later to whoever came after her. Leave room for the cold. Don't pull the thread tight or it'll pucker. Let it breathe. This one is for a hard year. Maureen was beside her for most of it, from the time she was small enough to need a cushion on the chair to reach the frame. Iris never gave her busy work. She gave her seams that mattered, and when Maureen ruined one, Iris made her pick it out stitch by stitch and start again, and she did not soften it. By 11 Maureen could piece a log cabin block without a ruler. By 15 she was finishing quilts on her own, while Iris sat by the window, with her hands folded in her lap, watching the light change on the water. Iris taught her to quilt. She also taught her one thing that had nothing to do with fabric. You don't make a quilt to cover somebody, she said. You make it so that on the worst night of their life they can feel that somebody sat up working in the dark, thinking only of them. Maureen heard that more times than she could count. She heard it at 7 and at 17, and she heard it the last morning she spent in that front room before she moved to Halifax for a job and a husband and a life that would take her 24 years to understand. She had signed away 1 page at a time. She left at 23. There was work in the city, a fabric and notions shop on Quinpool Road, then a quilting supply distributor where she ran the small orders desk for the better part of a decade. The morning she left Mahone Bay, Iris put 2 things in her hands. The pattern book and a photograph tucked into the front of it. Iris at 40, standing in front of the saltbox in a cotton dress, hands chalked white with marking powder, smiling like she had a secret she was choosing not to tell. Maureen carried both for 2 decades. The book went on a shelf in every apartment, then in the house on Edgewater Lane, and after Iris died at 83, on a Tuesday in March, in the same room she'd quilted in, the frame still set up 12 feet from the bed, Maureen closed the book and did not open it again. Not for 4 years. Not until the night there was nothing else left to open. She met Gerald Ainsworth when she was 28. He was 32, a junior partner at a development firm that built strip plazas and townhouse rows out toward Bedford and Sackville. He had good shoes and a way of making the future sound like a thing he had already been to and come back from. He remembered what she'd said 2 conversations ago. He had a plan for everything, and that was the part she fell for. Because Maureen had grown up, watching her grandmother live one careful winter at a time, and a man who could see 10 years out felt like solid ground. They married when she was 30. She kept working until their son was born, Owen, when she was 32, and then Gerald suggested she didn't need to anymore. Daycare in the city would eat most of what she made, and his commissions were climbing. It made sense. When Maeve came 2 years later, it made sense again. He suggested he handle the accounts, because he did it all day for a living, and she had enough to manage with 2 small children and a house. It made sense. He suggested, the year they refinanced, that the deed go in his name alone, because the rate was better with a single borrower, and it was only paperwork. She signed the last 2 pages without reading the 11 before them. That is what you do when you trust somebody. You sign, and you go put supper on. He was good in front of people. At his firm's dinners he was the provider. At his sister's place he was the easy uncle. In front of Owen and Maeve, he was the dad who coached minor hockey on Saturday mornings and grilled on the deck in summer. Maureen made the food for every one of those dinners and quilted the throw on the back of every couch his colleagues admired. And when somebody said the blanket was beautiful, he said his wife was crafty and changed the subject. It was always we did some renovating, never Maureen built that. For 20 years her hands were under everything in that house, and her name was on none of it. Not the mortgage, not the line of credit, not the truck, not the registered investments, not even the Costco card. She didn't notice. That is the thing nobody tells you about control when it comes in slowly. You never feel the floor tilt. You just wake up one ordinary morning and find you are standing on a slope, and you have no memory of when it stopped being level. What she did not know was why, and the why is the part that took Maureen the longest to forgive herself for not seeing. Gerald had spent the late years of their marriage chasing a single project. A 40-unit waterfront development outside Dartmouth that he had personally guaranteed to the partners would make his career. He had leveraged everything to get in. And by the time the costs ran over and the lead investor got cold feet, Gerald was a man holding a debt the size of a house with his name alone on the line. He did not see a wife who had given him 2 decades. He saw an asset column. He had always, somewhere underneath the good shoes, resented that people in the city remembered her quilts and forgot his plazas, that her quiet was mistaken for strength and his loudness for nerves. Now the resentment had a use. If the project went down, it could not take her with it, because there would be nothing left in her name to take, and if the marriage went down, too, all the better. He could land softly on everything that had ever been theirs. He hired a lawyer named Lyle Bremner, who did not handle feelings, only structures, and over 14 months, Bremner moved every piece off the board while Maureen drove Owen to practice and helped Maeve with her reading. In April, the deed was already his. In July, the joint savings, $31,000, quietly became an account at a branch on the other side of the harbor in his name, statements redirected to his office. In September, the investments were locked into a holding he controlled. In November, the truck title changed hands. In January, her credit cards were canceled, and Gerald said there had been fraud and new ones were coming. The new ones came in his name only, and she never saw them. 7 instruments. 14 months. Every one of them processed on a day she was packing lunches. The papers themselves came on a gray Thursday. In late winter, the harbor the color of dishwater out the kitchen window. Gerald set the envelope on the counter between the kettle and a bowl of clementines and stood in the doorway with his arms folded and watched her read. She read all of it, 20-some pages, standing, holding a tea towel she didn't remember picking up. She did not sit down. She did not raise her voice. She set the pages back exactly where he had put the envelope and looked at him. And he looked at her, and neither of them said one word. And that silence was the truest conversation of their marriage. The hearing moved fast, because his side had been moving for over a year. Bremner argued for primary custody, and the argument was almost obscene in how simple it was. Maureen had no income. Maureen had no account in her own name. Maureen had not been employed in 14 years. Maureen had no assets, no credit history, no fixed address she could point to as her own. On paper, the woman did not exist. He presented Gerald as the sole provider with a stable 4-bedroom home and a salary on letterhead, and the judge, bound by what was in front of her and not by what was true, granted Gerald interim primary custody of both children pending the final order. Interim. But the word did not feel temporary to Maureen. It felt like a storm door pulled shut against the wind. She packed one suitcase. Her clothes, the pattern book, the photograph inside the cover. And she took the one thing nobody had thought worth itemizing. Iris's cedar trunk, the one that had ridden up from Mahone Bay in the back of the truck years ago, packed with the last of Iris's quilts and a folded depth of fabric the old woman had been saving her whole life for projects she never got to. There was $140 left in an old checking account from the first year of the marriage, a joint account Gerald had forgotten existed and never bothered to close. $140 and a trunk of cloth. The things they missed. She left Edgewater Lane on a Friday morning, with sleet coming sideways off the harbor. She did not look back at the house. She looked at the trunk in the back seat, and the book in her lap, and the photograph of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and raised 3 children on a quilter's nothing, and still smiled like she'd won. Sandra Pelletier had a 2-bedroom in Dartmouth, up the hill from the ferry terminal, and she worked nights in the ICU at the Nova Scotia Health Centre, 7 to 7, 4 shifts a week, coming home to an apartment that smelled of the coffee she'd brewed 12 hours before. Maureen slept on the pullout, $140 in an envelope in the side of her bag. For the first 3 days, she did not really leave the couch. She did not eat much. She sat by the window and watched the freezing rain turn the parking lot to glass and the commuters pick their way to the ferry with their heads down. There were 2 texts on her phone. The first, from Owen, said, "When are you coming home?" The second, a day later, said, "Maeve keeps asking." She read both of them more times than she could stand, and she answered neither, because she could not tell her son she was coming home, when she did not know if it was true, and she would not lie to him the way she had been lied to. She put the phone face down on the cushion and let the screen go dark. On the 4th night, she could not sleep. Sandra was at the hospital. The apartment was dark, and the heat ticked in the baseboards, and a snowplow went by on the street below, scraping its blade, and then it was quiet again. She sat up. She reached down to the trunk she had pushed against the couch, and she lifted the lid, and the cedar smell came up out of it like a hand on the back of her neck. On top was a quilt she had not seen in years. Iris's, a storm at sea in grays, and a single shocking line of red, the binding worn soft. Underneath, the pattern book, and when she opened it, the photograph slid out and landed on her lap. Iris at 40. Chalk on her hands, that smile. She turned to the first page. Pencil careful, the letters slanting the way they had since 1962. A double wedding ring with a note crammed up the margin. Don't rush the curves, ease them. A curve forced is a curve that fails. She turned the page. A bear's paw, and beneath it in smaller writing. This one for a hard year, leave the points sharp so they remember to fight. Every page had a note. Every note sounded like Iris was in the room, not loud, not weepy, just there the way she had always been. Maureen closed the book and held it against her chest and sat in the dark a long time. She got up before Sandra came home. She cleared the kitchen table and lifted the fabric out of the trunk and began, for the first time in 4 years, to lay out a quilt. When Sandra opened the door at 7:15, gray with the long night, the apartment was covered in cut cotton, and there was a woman at the table with pins in her mouth who looked, for the first time in months, like she was inside her own body. Sandra stood in the doorway. Maureen looked up. Neither of them made a thing of it. I need somewhere to sell these, Maureen said around the pins. Sandra set down her keys. The Seaport Market, she said. Saturdays. My cousin sells preserves there. I'll make a call. She split the $140 on the kitchen table that afternoon. $45 for the vendor day fee, the rest for thread and batting, and a roll of cotton from the discount end at the fabric warehouse out by the highway. She had 2 of Iris's finished quilts and 3 small ones of her own. Table runners, really. Baby blankets, and a borrowed folding table and a piece of Bristol board with prices written in marker. The first Saturday, she rode the bus across the bridge with the quilts in green garbage bags so they wouldn't get wet, set up at the far end of the hall between a man selling birdhouses and a woman selling beeswax, and sold one. A baby quilt, $35, to a grandmother buying for a shower. People walked past, they slowed, most kept going. Maureen did not call out to anybody. She had never in her life called out to anybody. She stood behind the table and let the work speak the way Iris had taught her, which is to say not at all, only to wait and be honest and let people feel the difference in their own hands. At 1:45, a woman in her 60s stopped and ran her palm over the storm at sea and went very still. She turned the corner of it back and looked at the binding, the stitches, the back. "Who taught you to do this?" she said. It was not a casual question. Maureen told her, "My grandmother, Mahone Bay," in short sentences, no story, no pity. The woman nodded slowly. "Nobody finishes a back like this anymore," she said. "They machine it, and they think we can't tell." She did not buy the Storm at Sea, which Maureen would not have sold anyway, but she bought a runner and a baby quilt, and she took a slip of paper with Maureen's number on it, and she came back the next Saturday with her sister, and the sister came back the Saturday after that with a photograph of a bed she wanted a quilt to fit. By the end of the first month, Maureen was taking commissions she had no real space to fill, sewing past midnight on Sandra's kitchen table, the numbers climbing the way Iris's quilts always built, not in a leap, but a row at a time, slow and without stopping. There was a problem, and she found it the way she found most hard things that year, alone at a public library terminal on Alderney Drive, because she had no laptop and no internet at Sandra's. Selling finished goods at a public market in the city meant a vendor's permit, and past a certain volume, the province started caring whether you were a hobby or a business. HST registration, a business number, the difference between a craft table and a going concern. She read the Service Nova Scotia pages line by line for an entire afternoon, taking notes on the back of a grocery receipt, and the truth landed on her plainly. She had been operating as a business for 6 weeks without knowing she was one. She was not in trouble yet, but she could not keep working out of a friend's kitchen and pretending it was a kitchen. And she could not afford a storefront. She had, after that first month, maybe $400 to her name and a stack of orders she could fill in a real space in half the time. A proper shop in the city ran $2,000 a month before the lights were on. She closed that browser tab. She did what she could instead. Registered the business number, opened, for the first time in her adult life, a checking account with only her own name on it, and felt something turn over in her chest when the teller slid the card across the counter, because a man she had loved for 20 years had taught her, without meaning to, the most expensive lesson of her life. Never let your whole existence live on a document somebody else can sign. Ruth Hatfield found her, the way the right people found Maureen all that year, by smelling the work before they ever spoke to her. Ruth was 74, and she had run a quilt and dry goods shop on Main Street in Mahone Bay for 31 years before she closed it, 3 years after her husband Hollis died, because she could not stand to be in it alone. The building had sat shuttered since, the bolts of fabric still on the shelves under dust sheets, the long oak cutting tables still bolted to the floor, Hollis's old wood stove in the back, still capable of throwing heat if anybody fed it. Ruth had heard about a doucet selling quilts at the seaport and had driven up to Halifax on a Saturday to see for herself whether the name meant what she thought it did, and she had stood at the back of that market hall and watched a woman finish a back the way her own mother used to, and she had gone home and not slept. She drove Maureen down to Mahone Bay on a Sunday and pulled the dust sheet off the front window and let her look. Maureen stood in the middle of the floor of that dead shop, the oak tables, the wall of fabric, the light coming green through the old glass, and for the first time since the couch in Dartmouth she could see the next thing whole. "I'm not giving it to you," Ruth said, before Maureen could speak. "Hollis built those tables and I'll not hand them off like they're nothing. But I'll rent you the place for $400 a month, and you clean it and stock it on your own back, and if you're still standing after 6 months, I'll sell you the building for what we paid for it in 1986. Because I would rather it be a quilt shop run by a doucet than a coffee franchise run by strangers." It needed work. The roof leaked over the back corner, the wiring was older than Maureen, the stovepipe needed replacing, and a winter of damp had gone into the lower shelves. Maureen had no money for any of it. "You've got a county full of people who owe Hollis Hatfield a favor, and a grandmother whose quilts are on their grandkids' beds," Ruth said. "Ask, so," she asked, which was the hardest thing of all, for a woman raised to give and never request. A retired electrician named Burton Vaynot rewired the back room over 3 Saturdays and would not take $1, only a quilt for his wife's 70th. A boy named Tyler from the high school co-op program patched the roof for community service hours and a standing offer of Friday lunch. Sandra came down on her days off and scrubbed the place on her knees. By the time the first hard frost came, the stove was throwing heat, the shelves were dry, and over the door, where Hatfield's dry goods had hung for 31 years, there was a new sign Maureen had lettered herself with a stencil and a tin of paint from the hardware on Edgewater Road. Iris's Corner. She hung the photograph by the cutting table. Iris 40, chalk on her hands, that secret smile, and she opened the pattern book to the first page, and she started to work in a real place at last. The shop did not make her rich. It made her steady. Locals came for repairs and remnants in the winter, tourists came for finished quilts in the summer, and word traveled the slow, reliable way that good handwork travels, hand to hand, bed to bed. By the following autumn she had 4 standing commissions a month and a small workshop on Wednesday evenings teaching teenagers to piece a block without a ruler, the way she'd been taught, and Owen and Maeve were spending every second weekend with her. Under a court order, Gerald fought and lost. And the second weekends were starting to feel less like visits and more like the only real days of the month. It was a CBC producer named Renee Comeau who walked into the shop the next spring, doing a regional series on makers keeping old crafts alive on the South Shore, and asked Maureen if she would let them film. Maureen said she needed to think about it. She called Sandra that night and asked what she should do, and Sandra asked the only question that mattered. What would your grandmother say? Maureen looked at the photograph on the wall a long time. She called Renee back in the morning and said yes. She did not tell anyone the rest of it, the marriage, the 7 documents, the courtroom, and she did not plan to. She thought it was a story about quilts. But word of a camera in a quilt shop in Mahone Bay travels, and it reached Gerald the way bad weather reaches a harbor, all at once and from every direction. He called her on a Tuesday evening. She was at the cutting table, with the shop closed and the stove low. She saw his name and let it ring twice and picked it up, because she was not afraid of his voice anymore. He used her name softly, the way he used to when he wanted a thing to sound like it had been her idea. He said their private business had no place on television. He said it would hurt the children. He said Owen was being asked about it at school. She let him finish every word. "I'm not telling our story, Gerald," she said. "I'm finishing mine." She hung up and set the phone down by the iron and went back to easing a seam and that was the last time she ever picked up when he called. Within the hour, Gerald had Lyle Bremner on the phone, and within the week Bremner had couriered a letter to the CBC Bureau in Halifax warning that any broadcast referencing Gerald Ainsworth or the details of the divorce would be treated as defamatory and met with legal action. It was the single worst thing he could have done, and he did it because control was the only language he had ever spoken. The producer read the letter. The producer took it to her senior editor. The senior editor read it, set it down, and looked at Renee for a long moment, because a developer threatening a national broadcaster over a 2-minute segment about his ex-wife's quilt shop is not a legal problem. It is a much bigger story than the one they had come to film. The piece grew. It went from a regional spot to a feature, from 2 minutes to 12, from a Saturday afternoon slot to a national morning broadcast. And the angle quietly shifted from a craft to something older and more familiar to every person who watched it. A woman who had been written off a balance sheet and had built, with her own hands, something nobody could sign away. They aired it on a Thursday in May. Maureen sat in the studio in Halifax under lights that were too warm and answered the questions plainly, in short sentences, the way she answered everything. She did not weep, and she did not perform. Near the end, the host asked her what her grandmother would have made of all this, and Maureen looked into the camera for a second too long, the way people do when they're not talking to the host anymore. Gerald watched it from the condo in the South End he was renting because the bank had taken the house on Edgewater Lane along with everything he had pledged against the Dartmouth project. A project whose lead financing had been quietly pulled 3 months earlier when the firm's partners decided they did not want their name beside his. He lost 2 contracts in the same quarter, not because anyone set out to ruin him, but because nobody wanted to sit across a table from a man whose ex-wife was on the morning news being praised by the country for surviving him. Tanya, the woman he had been seeing since before the papers were served, who had met him as a man with a waterfront development and a 4-bedroom house, stopped returning his calls that June. She did not explain that. She had been there for what he represented, and what he represented was repossessed. The final invoice from Bremner came to $51,000. 14 months of strategy, the filings, the custody motions, the cease and desist that had detonated in his hand. Gerald had spent $51,000 to take everything from a woman who had left with $140. And in the fall, when the custody order came up for review, the court looked at a different picture entirely. A stable shop, a steady income, 2 children who, asked where they wished to live, said her name without hesitating. Custody went to Maureen. The court ordered Gerald to pay child support out of whatever he had left, which was not much because he had spent it proving she had nothing. He tried, in the final accounting, to have the cedar trunk and Iris's quilts and the pattern book declared marital property and split. And Bremner, to his credit, told him it was a fool's errand, and it was. A judge does not know what to do with a quilt. You cannot appraise a winter somebody survived. The trunk stayed where it was, in the back of a shop in Mahone Bay, and Gerald paid $400 an hour to be told he could not have the one thing in the marriage that had ever been worth keeping. The first night Owen and Maeve stayed for good was a Thursday in late October, with the season's first real cold coming in off the bay and the streetlights haloed in the fog. Maureen had a small apartment above the shop by then. She had put 2 new beds in the back room and pulled, from the cedar trunk, the Storm at Sea, Iris's, the Greys, and the single line of red, and laid it across the foot of her daughter's bed, and a bear's paw across her son's. She fed the stove. She made a simple supper the way Iris used to on a cold night, and the 3 of them ate at a table by the window, with the fog pressing against the glass. Maeve was the one who noticed the photograph on the wall. "Who's that?" she said, pointing with her fork. Maureen looked at it. Chalk on the hands, that smile. "That's the woman who taught me everything I know," she said. After supper, Maeve climbed under the storm at sea and ran her small hand over the worn binding, and was quiet for a while, the way her mother had been quiet at the same age, feeling for the stitches in the dark. "Did somebody make this for me?" she asked. Maureen sat on the edge of the bed. "Somebody made it 40 years ago," she said, "for a girl who hadn't been born yet. She just trusted she was coming." Outside, the fog thickened over the bay, and the cold came down, and inside it did not reach them, because there were 2 quilts in that back room older than the marriage that had tried to erase the hands that made them, and the hands had outlasted the man after all. Here is the thing Gerald never understood about Maureen, the thing he could not take because he could not see it to take it. It was never in the accounts. It was in a back you finish by hand, because the person under it deserves to be thought of even on the side they'll never look at. It was in a pencil note in a margin that said, "Leave room for the cold." Some men spend their whole lives building things they can put their name on, and the building is the point, and when it falls there is nothing underneath it. Maureen inherited something that could not be deeded or transferred or locked in a holding. A needle, a trunk of cloth, a photograph of a woman who poured 40 winters into a brown paper book and trusted that the right pair of hands would carry it forward. The people who only see what a thing is worth on paper will always miss the thing that was never on paper to begin with. And by the time they understand that, it is usually too late to do anything but watch. This story is fiction. The names and the town and the people in it were imagined, and no real person is drawn here. But the pattern underneath it is not invented. Coercive control, the slow moving of a marriage's assets into one person's name. Custody decided less by who loves the children and more by whose name is on the documents. These are not made up. Researchers who study family violence in this country have found that financial abuse runs through a large share of cases, often without a single raised voice, and that it is one of the hardest forms to prove precisely because it looks, on paper, like ordinary trust. Canada has begun, only recently, to write coercive control into the way family courts think. It is late, and it is not enough yet, but it is something. If you or someone you know is living inside one of these slow winters, a family law clinic or a women's shelter can help you understand what is yours before it stops being yours. Dialing 2111 anywhere in the country will point you to the nearest one. Keep an account in your own name. Read the 11 pages before the 2 they ask you to sign. None of it is suspicion. All of it is survival. And the question the whole thing turns on, the one that will split any room you ask it in. If a person spent 14 months making sure you had nothing, and then watched you build a life out of the little they forgot to take, and lost everything of their own in the watching, would you ever let them back through the door? Or would you let them sit with exactly what they built? Leave your answer below. Some of you already know which kind of person you are. The rest of you are about to find out. I keep coming back to that $140. Not because it was so little, though it was, but because of what it actually measured. It was everything Gerald forgot to take, and the only reason he forgot it was that he never once thought it was worth anything. That is the whole story, really. A man can spend 14 months and $51,000 hunting down every line item of a marriage, and still walk right past the one thing that mattered, because he had trained himself his whole life to only see what shows up on a statement. What undid Gerald was not bad luck. It was the straight line of cause and effect he set in motion himself. He moved the money in secret, so the court only saw what he wanted it to see. He sent a threatening letter to a newsroom, so a 2-minute spot became a national story. Every door he slammed on Maureen swung back and caught him on the way out. Nobody arranged that. He built it, board by board, the same way he built everything, and then he had to live in it. And what saved Maureen was not luck either. I think it came down to 3 things, and I've thought about them a lot since. The first is that she stayed honest when it would have been easier not to. She finished the backs of quilts nobody would ever see. She opened an account in her own name and kept clean books. She refused to go on television and trade her children's privacy for revenge. Decency, it turns out, is not softness, it's a spine. The second is that she learned. She sat at a library terminal for an afternoon and taught herself the rules that had been used against her, and she never let herself be uninformed about her own life again. That kind of clear-eyed, do-the-homework judgment is what tells you which fights to take and which papers to read before you sign. And the third is that she simply did not stop. 40 quilts a winter started as one runner sold at a folding table. She climbed it a row at a time, the way Iris taught her, and she kept climbing on the nights it would have been completely reasonable to quit. Those three things together are not a personality. They are a practice. You build them the way you build anything that lasts. Slowly, on the ordinary days, when no one is watching and there's no camera and no crowd. Iris understood that. She poured 40 winters into a brown paper book and trusted the right hands would carry it. The lesson I take from Maureen is the same one, in plainer words. Be the kind of person who can be trusted. Keep learning so you can't be fooled, and outlast the people who only ever bet against you. Do that long enough, and you won't need the room to clap. You'll already be home,